Hippocrates peri aeron hydaton topon, Chapter 2. Chapter 2 completes the author's introduction, in which he lays out the things the aspiring medical student should make a study of before beginning his career as an itinerant physician. Chapter 2 adds to this curriculum knowledge of meteorology and astronomy. Kai apotuton kre enthumestai hekasta, egar tauta edeetis kalos, malista men panta, edeme tage plesta, uk an auton lanthanoi es polin apignomenon hes an aperos ute nosemata epicoria, ute ton coelion he pusis hocoe tisistin. And beginning with these things, that is, the subjects of study he specified in Chapter 1, it is necessary to ponder each particular. For if one were to know these things well, ideally all of them, but at least most of them, then upon arriving in a city he is unfamiliar with, he would be ignorant neither of the local diseases nor the status of the internal constitution, literally of the guts, bowels, or internal cavities of the inhabitants. Ex his enim singula sunt investiganda, nam qui haec omnia probe quantum fieri potest cognoveret aut horum plurima, eum non latere possunt cum in urbem etiam ignotam sibi perveneret, neque morbi regioni peculiares et patrii, neque communis regionis natura, quaecunque tandem affuerit. And Cornarius's communis regionis natura here translates a different reading in the Greek text, ton koinon he pusis, rather than ton koilion he pusis. Hosta me apor estai en te therapee ton nuson me de diamartanen, ha ecosesti gignestai en metis tauta protoron edos proprontise peri hecastu, with the result that he will not be at a loss in his treatment of diseases nor make mistakes. These are the likely results if he hasn't gotten to know these things and think through each of them ahead of time. Ut non possit in cognoscendis morbis dubius haerere, aut errare sicubi ad morborum medicationem ad habeatur, quae ambo illis evenire solent, qui non prius providi haec diligenter cognoverunt. Hosta me apor estai en te therapee ton nuson me de diamartanen is usually interpreted as meaning that, armed with knowledge of the particular situation, climate, and water supply of a strange city, the physician will not be at a loss for how to treat diseases there and will not make mistakes. For example, as translated by W.H.S. Jones in the Loeb edition, quote, so that he will not be at a loss in the treatment of diseases or make blunders. But a South African scholar named Peter Brain pointed out that Ayres Waters Places only asserts that in a town with a particular situation, climate, and water supply, the inhabitants will tend toward a certain physical type and constitution, and that certain specified diseases will tend to occur, and that a properly prepared physician will know these in advance. It does not claim that this knowledge will or can help the physician decide how to treat individual cases. How could it? What me aporestai really means, according to Peter Brain, is more practical and concrete, namely that, applying this advanced knowledge, the itinerant physician will not arrive without having selected and packed the equipment and drugs he will most likely need in quantity. For this interpretation of aporestai, Brain draws on another work from the Hippocratic corpus on decorum peri el schemosunes. You must prepare in advance, the author of this treatise says, hin e soi pro cat ertis mena organata kai mekanai kai sideros kai tahexes, in order that you may have ready beforehand instruments, appliances, knives, and so forth. Hegar entutoisin aporie a mekanie kai plabe. For lacking these resources, that's the aporie, means helplessness and harm. Esto desoi hetere par exodos prostas apodemias. Also see that you have a second physician's case for your journey. One, he goes on to say, that is compartmentalized to carry the chief medical necessaries. Pro kataskeoasto desoi kai malagmaton genea, potemata, prepare in advance the appropriate types of emollients and purgatives. Epende es ies proston noseonta, tuton soi apertis menon hineme apores. When you enter a sick man's room, having made these arrangements that you may not be at a loss, pro diastelestai un cre to ekbesomenon ectes imperies, endoxongar kai elmates. So you must from your experience forecast what the issue will be. To do so adds to one's reputation, and the learning thereof is easy. And it is with respect to this matter of the physician's reputation that we should interpret mede diamartanen in AWP. Diamartanen here doesn't mean commit mistakes, says Brain, make blunders in Jones' translation. It means to fail utterly and become a laughingstock. Concern for reputation is a consistent theme in the Hippocratic corpus. For diamartane, meaning to fail utterly, Brain cites this passage from Plato's Theaetetus. Socrates, stipulating that a city always makes its laws to be most advantageous to itself, asks, E un kai tuncane ae, e pola kai diamartane hecaste. Then does the city also hit the mark every time, or does every state often miss its aim completely? Before we leave it, take note in the on decorum how the verbs emphasize the advanced preparation the itinerant physician is advised to undertake. Pro katartis mena, that is, pro katartisto, pro katascoasdo, pro diastelomai. Hoste me aporestai ente terapee ton nuson me de diamatanen. Ha ecosisti gignestai in metis tauta proteron edos proprontise peri hecastu. Tu de chronu pro iontos kai tu eni autu legoi an hocosata nosemata mele pankoina tempolin kataskesen e teraos e kemonos, hosate idia hecastoi kindunos gignestai ec metaboles tes diaites. But as the period and the year pass, he would be able to say how many diseases are going to afflict the entire city, either in summer or in winter, and how many particular to individuals there is a danger of from a change in their diet. Edoscar ton horeon tas metabolas kai ton astron epitolaste kai dusias kat oti hekaston tuton gignetai pro ede anto etos hokoionti mele gignestai. For knowing the changes of the seasons and the risings and settings of the stars, in what manner each of these occurs, he would be able to foretell what kind of year it's going to be, health-wise, that is. Quare qui ea studiose rimatus fueret, unius cuiusque temporis ac anni futuri constitutionem praedicere poteret, qui videlicet morbi communi ad factione civitatem sent invasuri tum aestate tum hieme, et quacunque pericula unicuique sent timenda ex diaetae ac victus immutatione. cum enim temporum mutationes et astrorum ortus ac occasus observaveret, quem admodum singula horum eveniant, praenoscet utique et de anno, qualis sit futurus. Note that risings of the planet Sun are anatolas, risings of the fixed stars epitolas. Technically, you haven't learned epitolas from Comenius, but you figured it out anyway. Note also that we have astron underlined in the Greek, but not astrorum in the Latin. Do you know why? Because the Latin word you learned for stars in Comenius is stellae. Hutos antis en noelmenos kai pro ginoscon tus kairus malistan edee peri hekastu kai ta plesta tunkanoi tes hygiees kai kat orthon peroito ukelakista in te techne. Taking notice of these things in this manner and knowing ahead of time the periods, we'll come back to what kairus may mean here, he would best know what to do in each case and would, in the most instances possible, secure health and achieve in no small way success in his art. And notice the verb tunkanoi we saw in that quote from Plato's Theaetetus, the opposition between tunkanen and di amartanen. Hoc namque modo, si quis rimatus fueret, ac praecognoveret temporum occasiones, maxime de singulis sciet, ut plurimumque sanitatem adsequetur et recta via procedet, non minima artis suae gloria. And I like that rhetorical flourish in Cornarius's translation, which captures the Greek concern for reputation, short and long term. Non minima artis suae gloria. A slide or two ago, we looked at an extract from the work on decorum in the Hippocratic corpus, and we saw a series of verbs beginning with pro, emphasizing advanced preparation. Notice the similar accumulation of verbs here in Chapter 2 of AWP. Pro prontisse, pro edee, pro ginoscon, in this case with the emphasis on the predictive. Compare our word prognosis, but in a medical context, prognosis usually refers to a prediction only after the onset of a disease. E de doceoitis tauta meteorologa enae, e me metastae tes gnomes, matoi an hoti uc elakiston meros symbalatai astronomiae es iatricen, ala panu pleston, hamagar tesin horesi, kai hai koiliae metabalusi toisi anthropoisin. But if one should dismiss these things as belonging to meteorology, if he should not change his opinion, he would learn one day that astronomy contributes not the least, but rather the most, to the art of medicine. For men's inner constitutions, their guts, change in sync with the changes in the seasons. And a mea culpa, we had the word meteoros in Chapter 1, which of course is the title of the Janua's peri ton meteoron and the Orbis Pictus's meteora, but I forgot to underline it there, so I'm underlining it here. Quod siqui haec sublimiora videantur, is si ab hoc sententia non discedat, discet sane non minimam partem confere ad rem medicam ipsam astronomiam, sed omnino plurimam, cum una cum temporibus et ventriculi in hominibus mutentur. As you probably know, we have no autographed copies of ancient works. Dear reader, hope you enjoy this work, signed Hippocrates. Instead, what we normally have is one or more surviving manuscripts, the earliest of which is a copy made many centuries after the author's death. Almost always and inevitably, given the tedious process of copying and binding of folios, these manuscripts contain variant readings and various types of corruption. In other words, in almost all cases, we either don't have the text exactly as the author originally wrote it, or it's a difficult job to reconstruct it. The awesome task of the editor of an ancient work is to first decide among these textual variants in the manuscript tradition, and second, to decide among suggested emendations offered by scholars over the centuries, or make her own. A critical edition of a work is an edition that has a critical apparatus at the foot of each page, showing the variants and emendations from among which the editor made her choices. The editor provides the abbreviations for the manuscripts referred to in the critical apparatus in a table called the Conspectus Sigillorum. After you've had Greek or Latin 101 and are attempting your first readings, you probably prefer to remain blissfully ignorant of these complications. You accept the text the editor has provided. You may eventually progress to the point of using critical editions, but even if you never need to or care to get to that level of reading, the textual history itself can be fascinating. As the saying goes, habent sua fata libelli. The history of airs, waters, places is a perfect illustration, and I'm going to use Chapter 2 here just to give a flavor. If you're not interested, please simply skip to the video for Chapter 3. I'm going to take 5 examples from the text, but first let's get our passports ready and travel to the many libraries in Europe and the Middle East that have manuscripts of AWP, beginning with the late 12th century Greek manuscript known as Vaticanus Graecus No. 276, which we'll call V. This Vatican manuscript is one of 9 Greek manuscripts we have of AWP. 6 of the remaining 8 are 15th and 16th century manuscripts scattered about in different libraries in Europe that were copied directly or indirectly from V. Although textual reconstruction is complicated business, a general rule is that if we know B is copied from A, B is of no value in reconstructing the author's original text because all B can do is introduce more errors during the copying process. Therefore, these 6 manuscripts are of no value in determining Hippocrates' original text. Of the remaining 2 manuscripts, one, the Codex Barberinianus Graecus No. 5, also at the Vatican, was thought at the turn of the 20th century to be independent of V and of significant value. You can see this, for example, in W.H.S. Jones' introduction in the Loeb edition. However, later in the century, Hans Diller proved that the source of the Barberinianus and the other remaining Greek manuscript was actually print editions of AWP, print editions by the very Janus Cornarius, whose Latin translation of AWP we are using. So, V emerges as the sole surviving Greek manuscript of value in determining Hippocrates' original text. Interestingly, however, there were other Greek manuscripts independent of and earlier than V that, although they no longer survive, we can partially reconstruct. Agostino Gadaldino was a 16th century Venetian physician and notable scholar. He edited the first great Latin edition of the complete works of Galen. He also made notes on Hippocrates AWP, attributing many of his readings to what he called a Vetus Codex, a Greek manuscript that is no longer in existence, but which scholars have determined was from the Byzantine era, i.e. much earlier than V. So Gadaldino's notes become an independent source of value in reconstructing Hippocrates' text. V suffers from one big problem. Somewhere along the line in this branch of the tradition, a bookbinder had mixed up some folios and V presents the chapters of AWP in what was eventually realized to be the wrong order. The correct order is preserved in 3 9th century manuscripts of a Latin translation of the AWP that probably goes back to a 5th century Greek exemplar. This Latin translation thus represents another branch earlier than and independent of V. An additional Latin translation from the 11th or 12th century and from a different and later Greek exemplar was discovered late last century in Munich and is also of value. Juana calls it Lat 2. Hans Diller's 1970 and Jacques Juana's 1996 critical editions, the Boudet was reissued in 2003, are the essential resources if you're interested in the textual history of AWP. Juana's edition made a few advances on Diller's because several manuscripts, including Lat 2, only came to light after Diller's publication. But Latin was not the only target language of a 9th century AWP translation. Hunayn ibn Ishaq was an Arab scholar from Mesopotamia in the 9th century during the Great Abbasid Caliphate. He was conversant in Arabic, Syriac, Persian, and Greek, and was called by his fellow Arabs the Sheikh of the translators. What Hunayn and his school translated was not actually AWP, but Galen's commentary on AWP. Galen wrote commentaries on several works of Hippocrates. His method was to quote a passage from Hippocrates, what we call a lemma, or lemmata in the plural, and then under the lemma write out his exegesis on that passage. Thus, the lemmata serve as an indirect witness to the manuscript of Hippocrates Galen had in hand. Now, no Greek manuscript of Galen's commentary on AWP has survived to our time, but translations from Hunayn's school do. Hunayn's original translation was into Syriac. By his own account, he didn't finish, but in a subsequent division of labor, he went on to translate the Hippocratian lemmata into Arabic and assign his nephew, Hubayas ibn al-Hasan, to translate Galen's exegesis. What remains of all that? Hunayn's Arabic translation of the lemmata survives in 3 manuscripts at the Hagia Sophia Museum Library in Istanbul and in another manuscript unknown to Diller from the Escorial in Spain. In addition, we have a Latin translation that was made from the Arabic. In fact, the Editio Princeps, or first print edition in Latin of AWP, was made in 1481 by Abu Bakr ar-Razi from this Latin translation. The Editio Princeps in Greek was from the Aldine Press in 1526. Hubayas' translation of the exegesis no longer exists in Arabic, but we have it in a Hebrew translation from the Arabic in a single manuscript at the Bodleian Library at Oxford and in a Latin translation from the Hebrew. Finally, in 1970, also after Diller had finished with his edition, an extremely important Arabic manuscript came to light at the National Library in Cairo. It contains the full text of Galen's commentary, lemmata, and exegesis, as well as a lengthy introduction. Now, Juana concluded it didn't contribute much to the reconstruction of Hippocrates' text that we didn't already know from our translations of the lemmata, but it was nevertheless a momentous discovery. And one thing we learned from it was that Hubayas' translation was only an abstract of Galen's complete commentary, which we have now in the Cairo manuscript. Galen makes occasional citations of AWP in his other writings, and besides Galen there are parallel passages of parts of AWP in other ancient literature, for example in a work of Aristotle's or perhaps pseudo-Aristotle's called Problems. Keep in mind that Hippocrates lived before Plato and Aristotle. In sum, here is a simplified version of the Stemma Codicum from the Boudet edition. A stemma codicum is a graphic representation of the relationship between manuscripts. The 4 Greek manuscripts of importance for determining Hippocrates' original text are, above all, the Vaticanus Graecus, then the Vetus Codex that we can partially reconstruct from Gadaldino's notes, the Greek exemplar we can partially reconstruct from the 9th century Latin translation, and the later Latin translation called Lat II in our Conspectus Siglorum. Again, if you're using the Loeb edition, be aware that Jones, following an earlier German edition, gave independent weight to the Barberinianus manuscript. We now know that is wrong, but the Barberinianus is an interesting exhibit in the overlapping activities of traditional scribal copyists on the one hand and entrepreneurial print merchants on the other in the 15th and 16th century European Renaissance, which is itself a fascinating history. In addition to the direct witness of these original Greek manuscripts and partially reconstructed Greek manuscripts, we have a very valuable indirect witness to Hippocrates' text in the Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin translations of Galen's commentary on AWP. And finally, we have citations from other works of Galen, as well as parallel passages in other ancient authors. Habent sua fata libelli. Having traveled to many dusty libraries in Europe and the Middle East, let's return to the comfort of our own home, pause for a cool drink, and, armed with this knowledge of the manuscript tradition of AWP, let's first look at 3 examples of text variances. The first example I'm actually taking from the end of chapter 1, where we had the rhetorically phrased and balanced sentence that ended, kai eta en koiloi ke mene kai pnigere, eta meteoros kai psucre. The reading in V is en koiloi esti. Diller and Joanna accept this reading, but with reservations we'll see in a sec. Based on the Latin translation in Concavo Constituta, the German scholar Hugo Kuhlwein suggested enkoilos, and that was picked up in the Loeb edition. While Joanna in the Boudet printed the reading of V, he says in his apparatus of Kuhlwein's emendation, fortasse recte. Nevertheless, the reading I actually gave you, with the participle kemene, was not from any of these sources, but from a passage referred to by Diller in his apparatus from Galen's work Hoti ho Aristos iatros kai Pilosopos. The best doctor is also a philosopher. In this work, Galen wrote, Cre iden de kai ten polin en koiloi kemenen kai ten ep hypselu. The context makes it clear Galen is getting this from AWP, though to be sure quite possibly from memory and not from a manuscript of Hippocrates in hand. Diller in his apparatus says of kemene fortasse recte. We liked it and published it here in our critical YouTube edition. A conscientious editor of a critical edition must wrestle with every word and phrase of the text, but this is an example where all the possible choices are just slight variances that mean pretty much the same thing, and the editor's choice doesn't really affect our understanding of the text. In the next example from chapter 2, the standard reading in this sentence, in editions up to the end of the 19th century, was the Ereomenos of V. Then a German scholar, the same Hugo Kuhlwein, suggested Ennoelmenos based on Gadaldino's notes and the Latin translation Intelligens. This was accepted by Jones in the Loeb and Diller in the CMG. Diller also found support for it in a later sentence in AWP. For the Boudet, Jacques Joanna reverted to the earlier Ereomenos on the grounds that it is the Lectio Difficilior. One rule of textual criticism is that if a scribe is more likely to have changed A into B than B into A, that is, A is the Lectio Difficilior, then select A. In this case, Joanna argues a scribe is more likely to have changed eroomenos to ennoelmenos than vice versa. Eroaomai, which is usually an active rather than a middle verb, by the way, means to search after, inquire into, whereas ennoeomai means to consider, to reflect on something that has already been inquired into or established. Not a huge difference, but one that will matter to a careful reader. Sometimes, though, the variants have entirely different meanings. Recall this sentence, uk an auton lanthanoi, ute nosemata epicoria, ute ton koelion hepusis ho koie tisistin. The manuscripts are split here between the readings koelion and koinon. The koinon, meaning koinon nosematon of vi, communes in the Latin translation, makes perfect sense, arguably better sense. The author distinguishes between universal and local phenomena many times. Already in chapter 1, for example, he distinguished between the common winds, ta koina pneumata, and the local, ta enhekaste kore epicoria eonta. Here in chapter 2, as translated by Jones, he will not be ignorant of the local diseases or of the nature of those that commonly prevail, and is translated by Cornarius, neque morbi regioni peculiares et patrii, neque communes regiones natura. On the other hand, as Joanna argues, koelion must win the day from the perspective of the textual history. First of all, in Greek uncial, the script of the early Greek manuscripts, it is very easy for the copyist to misread lambda iota as a nu. It is very easy, therefore, to imagine a copying error having occurred in the tradition after the Vetus Codex used by Gadaldino, a mistake inherited by V and by the Latin translation. Furthermore, the discovery of the Cairo manuscript seems to nail it, since that proves that the manuscript Galen had before him read koelion. Chapter 2 is still part of the author's introduction, and koelion pusis, inserted in the middle of its statement of broad themes, may seem jarringly particular. It did to me, especially if we're reading Greek medical texts for the first time. But in ancient medicine, the koilii are a seat of human health, and so the term koilii may serve as kind of a synecdoche for health as a whole. In fact, revisit how this chapter concludes. Hamagar tesin horesi kai hai koilii metabalusi toisin anthropoisin. How then to translate koilii? A little awkwardly. We translated it rather blandly as internal constitution. Joanna more literally as cavite, parens interne, which the German, with its penchant not unlike the Greeks for compounding words, can reduce to libes innata. The opposite of bland is Hayes Nimis's glossary definition, bowels. In the closing sentence, Jones translates koilii as digestive organs. That's too restrictive, says Joanna in his Boudet note. Koilie means more broadly cavity, and koilii throughout the Hippocratic corpus comprehend both an upper koilie, chest, and a lower koilie, belly, which you'll see when we get to chapter 4. Sometimes, in fact, the difficulty of interpretation is not due to textual variance, but to the semantic richness of a particular Greek word or phrase that is more or less impossible to render in translation. For example, when the author writes pro ginoskon tous kairous, what do you think he means by tous kairous? Be precise in your answer. If you're hesitating, don't feel bad. At least one whole book has been written on the subject. Jones's literal translation in the Loeb simply punts by learning the times beforehand. Learning the times. What the heck does that mean? At the opposite end of the spectrum, the Penguin translation, thus he would know what changes to expect in the weather, removes any ambiguity, but in my opinion is too restrictive and equally unsatisfactory for that reason. Does Cornarius's temporum occasiones also mean specifically changes in the weather? Perhaps, but while maybe not as semantically rich as the Greek kairos, Latin tempora also has a range of time-related meanings. Diller doesn't interpret it to mean weather at all, but rather the physician recognizing the correct moment for intervention, that is, for the application of some therapy. Juana similarly translates tus kairous as, quote, decisive moments. By kairous, he says, you must understand decisive moments either in the evolution of a disease, be it favorable or unfavorable, or in the treatment of a disease and the timing of the decision whether or not to intervene. But, he continues, decisive moments here must also be understood in connection with the changing of the seasons and with the rising and setting of the stars. You can capture this in commentary, but not in translation. Finally, sometimes there's neither textual variation nor any particular semantic richness in play, and yet we can still differ radically on the interpretation. Example, tum kanoi tes hygieis. We saw earlier in the quote from Plato's Theaetetus the opposition between tunkanen and diamartanen. The metaphor is archery. Diamartanen means to miss the mark entirely. In our context, for the physician to fail utterly and make a fool of himself. Tunkanen means the opposite. It means to hit the mark. In our context, for the physician who has studied the proper topics to achieve health. But whose health? I might not have questioned this had I not seen the Penguin translation, quote, and not only would he enjoy good health himself for the most part, but... Now, in my humble opinion, the context makes it pretty clear he's talking about his future patient's health, not his own. But the Greek is not explicit, nor are most of the other more or less literal translations of the Greek. The Loeb's securing health, Cornarius's sanitatem ad sequetur, Diller's beim Heilen richtig treffen. Only the Boudet is specific. Obtenir le retour à la santé clearly refers to patients. Let's posit that. But with tunkane tes hygieis, is the author speaking of the return to good health, exclusive of, for example, the prevention of bad health? Consider the 5 examples I've given you. You can only come to one conclusion. You are doing the right thing, learning to read works like peri aeron hydaton topon in the original. Speaking of the title peri aeron hydaton topon, and speaking of manuscript variants, we might as well tell you that the title of this work was not fixed in antiquity, and it has come down to us in many variants. Modern editors have stuck with peri aeron hydaton topon as found in V, but other sources have every permutation of these 3 words, as well as, for example, pairs such as Erotian's peri horon kai topon. I like Gadaldino's title because it covers all the main themes, peri aeron, topon, hydaton, kairon, anemon, asteron. Well, actually it doesn't. It doesn't have horon. Furthermore, as Joanna points out, the traditional title from V is inaccurate. The noun aer, ionic er, does not appear in the treatise in the plural, and as you now know, the term employed for winds is actually pneumata. Furthermore, the words aeron, hydaton, topon omit a key piece of the content, the seasons, horon. And speaking of seasons, after our excursion on the challenges of textual variation and interpretation, Let's not forget the intriguing point at the end of Chapter 2, that meteorology and astronomy, according to the author but not all his contemporaries, are an integral part of the physician's education. The author returns to that idea in chapters 10 and 11. Meanwhile, in chapters 1 and 2, the author has laid out all the main subjects of the work. I encourage you to reread those chapters. The next 4 chapters will teach the health effects of a city's exposure to winds from each of the 4 cardinal directions, beginning with the direction expressed as the region between the sun's winter solstitial rising and winter solstitial setting. Do you know which direction that is?